This is our presentation on site plans.
So what are site plans? Site plans are a model of a property displaying any proposed changes to it. These can be both electronic and physical. Now, obviously, older site plans are all going to be physical because they just didn't have the technology. But nowadays, most site plans are in fact physical. So they show the existing property, anything that's on it, and suggested modifications. They're mainly used for planning, so you know how everything's going to fit together and where it's going to go. Checking codes, so you can make sure that you're not violating any building codes. And also keeping records, just recording everything, so you can plan for the future. Next. So elements. These are what makes up the site plan, what you actually see when you look at a site plan. Now, there's several standard elements. First is a legal description of the property. Basically just says what the property is, who owns it, any sort of basic information about it. Next is property lines. These are lines that close off the property so you can see exactly what's inside it and what's outside of it. All these lines have dimensions and bearings, and there's a good example of this in assignment 3 that we all worked on. And next is the north arrow. This is pretty standard. It just lets you know what direction north is in. And from there, you can pretty much figure out any direction. Slopes and elevations. Basically, what's the elevation at it and how much does it change by per area. And last is setbacks. These are points that could be off the property line and they're basically just used as reference points for figuring out exactly where things might go on the property. Next. So now here's some more elements. These are structural elements. These can be anything that's like building, and these can be existing or proposed, and proposed. So these can be buildings, anything that's built by man would go on here. Roadways, pathways, all that can like show like where things may go. Water wells, it's a big one because it shows where water on the property is and where you could access it from. Septic tanks, this basically shows where waste would go. And also natural structures such as trees, bushes, anything like that. Next. And there's some other elements, utilities. This be sewage, gas and power lines, drains. These are basically all important because you wouldn't want to be, digging around in the ground and then accidentally hit a power line and knock out the power. So it just lets you know where everything is. Soil test holes. Basically, for field surveying, you may have to sample the soil, figure out exactly the properties of it. And anywhere where you test the soil, you'd want to mark on your site plans. And last is building information. This can just be basic information, like how many rooms are in a building or how many floors. But it can also be more technical information, like maybe what utilities that building has access to or the area of it, anything like that. Next.
So when coming up with site plans, there are certain design considerations that should be kept in mind when designing the site plan itself. One possible consideration is for future access to utilities. So as just mentioned in the previous slide, stuff like sewage, gas, and power, that all should be kept in mind, or like the locations of those utilities should be kept in mind so you're not coming up with site plans that restrict access to those utilities or makes it cumbersome to access for maintenance purposes as well. So you want to make sure that everything is clear and doesn't cause any unnecessary cumbersome load to maintaining any of those utilities themselves. Another consideration is the drainage direction when coming in and out of the site itself. So keeping aware of all the piping that is underground or going into the site itself, it should be kept going in the same pathway as it was before. Another design consideration is the property lines. Of course, you have access to the property in the form of easements, and you need to make sure that in the site plan it is staying true to those property lines, where you want the bearings to be all correct, and you want to make sure that it's kept within those bearings and property lines. There's also the pre-existing structures on the site that may need to be either put onto the site plan itself if there are new structures that are going to be put on there and that there's no intersection between those structures. And if there's something like a tree or bush or shrubbery, that if that needs to be removed, that also needs to be well detailed into the site plan. And there's also the slope grade variance on the different surfaces. There's going to be a different slope when it comes to a driveway or to a pathway compared to lawn or even foundation to the building. You want to make sure that all of that is well detailed. It's like driveways should only have a certain incline if it's going uphill or certain decline. There are standards that need to be kept, and pathways should stay relatively flat along the surface and along the roads that surround the site itself. Next slide. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, easements are basically what gives you access to the site itself. Easements are non-possessory, as in you don't own the property that you're operating on or taking the site plan of. Think of it more like trespassing on the property with no legal repercussions. So you have free access to modify or take notes on that. And there's also utility easements, which typically a lot of utility companies have access to maintenance the utilities on the site itself. And in the picture, which is a cut from a site plan, you can see where there is detailed areas on the site itself where the utility easements are located. Next slide.
So next is types of site plans. There's two main types. First is a single property. This is just going to show one property and every building on it. So these are pretty good for getting like a smaller area, and you can get pretty good detail with them. And usually mainly be used if you want to do something just that one property. Like for example, maybe you want to install a swimming pool or a shed in your backyard. Then you'd want to use a single property site plan of your property. Next slide. And the other main type is a neighborhood property. This is going to show an entire neighborhood. So multiple properties, as you can see. Now these are good because they cover a much greater area. So they're good for installing, maybe if you're installing a new roadway that would stretch through multiple properties, then you need every property to be able to reference it. Now, which one should you use? It 100% depends on what your situation is. So like I said, if you're doing something just to one local property, then you're probably going to want to use a single property. But if you need to do something to an entire neighborhood, then you're definitely going to need a neighborhood property. Now, you may want to combine a neighborhood property and a single property to show a grand big idea of what you're doing. And then you use the single property site plans to show the finer details of what you're doing. Next slide.
So in this slide, I'm going to be talking about some of the paperwork and permits that you would need to get done to have a site plan created. So most development is regulated under two different codes, the zoning code and the building code. And what zoning is a method of urban planning in which land is divided up into areas called zones. And what a zoning permit is a city issued document that allows you to use a property or building for its intended purpose. And a building permit is also a city issued document, and it allows you to proceed with the construction or remodeling of a project on your property. Sometimes a zoning permit is given as part of the building application, and in other instances you need a zoning permit prior to applying for a building permit. Next slide. So in this slide, I'm going to be talking about some of the site plan creation software and two of the main ones that you see used in the industry. The first being AutoCAD, and what CAD stands for is Computer Aided Design. So its full name is Auto Computer Aided Design. It's a 2D and 3D drafting tool, primarily used for 2D drafting. And well, what is AutoCAD used for? Some of the applications is architectural design, engineering design, and app design. And you can use AutoCAD to do zoning. Next slide. Next, I'm going to be talking about Civil 3D. And what Autodesk Civil 3D is a program built upon the CAD platform, just with an extra layer of 3D design. With Civil 3D, you can integrate ArcGIS, and with ArcGIS integration, it allows you to get up-to-date project information so you can access info like storm drains, gas lines, and how the water flow is in a specific area. Who uses Civil 3D? Some of the biggest industries that use this would be the architecture and planning industry, construction, and civil engineering. And the difference between Civil 3D and AutoCAD is that AutoCAD is a generic CAD platform, whereas Civil 3D is a vertical platform for civil engineering design built upon the CAD platform. Next slide.
Planning the site layout is necessary for all engineering, architectural, building, and construction projects. This site will be the foundation for the production of the projects. The primary reason is planning the site layout to produce and maximize working environment efficiency and safe construction activities. The site space is a major resource which in turn influences other resources such as money, material, labor, and equipment. Now into site layout planning. The site layout consists of four main components. When looking at the layout, one must consider the selection of site spaces that will be required. Also, deciding the sizes and different limitations of those spaces. Another component is building or establishing the connections between the facilities, and as always, one can improve the layout of the spaces on the site. Looking at specifics for the site layout plan, these include various zones specified for certain activities. Making sure these are exceptional emergency routes and arranging sections for waste management areas and welfare facilities. To continue with the site layout plan, as with everything, you will run into issues if you do not properly prepare. Some of these problems are caused by improper capacity, which could bring about harm to items and materials. Simply poor siting of the plant as well as poor siting of welfare areas. A big one is deficient space arrangement, which will cause a domino effect and cause other major problems and hefty delays. Also, unsuitable access or no concrete ways to enter the site that makes sense. And lastly, and very important, is security and safety issues. When examining the site layout, you must take into account the things that within the site that will change during the course of the works. There may be a number of different site layout plans for different phases. Now, getting into utilities, site plans include location of utility services in relation to the main space. Legends on site plans include gas, water, telephone, cable, sewage, steam connections, and many more. Utilities are represented by distinct lines categorized in the legend. These examples can be seen in the image below. Like looking right, here's the legend, and here are the utilities. Utilities represented by the different lines in the depths. Next slide.
Okay, for the sewage, a lot of times there'll be separate site plans and drawings done if you're mainly going for the sewage, or if not even for residential or commercial site plans. It's still very detailed and important to plan the sewage system and the septic tank. because that's really affects the environment a lot in our drinking water and everything like that. So there's a lot of requirements for a site plan of a sewage. Things such as like you must have a north arrow and a scale indicator, all the property information, including the parcel numbers, site addresses, any streets adjacent, any other buildings. Like everything has to be labeled. And yeah, a professional engineer has to be the one that designs this, obviously. It's a pretty important thing. Like there's many different rules and requirements based on it too, including like the slope, the type of surface and soil you're on, and all that has to be included on the site plan and like labeled in a legend. You move to the next slide. Yeah, here's like a picture of a sewer plan that has the depths and everything on the bottom, and then on the top it shows the top view and how everything is labeled out. And then you go to the next slide. And then this shows a septic tank, which is a really important part of the sewage system, which basically the septic tank just like filters out the waste and turns it into sludge into the bottom and collects oil and stuff on top. And yeah, it's really important that everything's shown and covered on the site plan map. Otherwise, it won't work properly, or else you won't even have the proper permits to build it. So yeah.
All right, so the general site plan is basically the entire area in which the proposed project is going to be worked on. So on the bottom right over here, you can see that there's a north arrow. As stated before, it's standard to have a north arrow in these drawings. However, I had to add it in separately for this particular drawing, which didn't have one. So why is the north arrow so important? So let's just say that it didn't have one and a contractor was viewing this map. He's going to be all sorts of lost, like going through the halls, looking for which room is what. It's just going to make life like so hard without like not having a north arrow. All right, you can move to the next slide. All right, so a section drawing is essentially a section of a general site plan drawing. So what does a section drawing do? It gives way more detail and clarity in what you're trying to view. So on the bottom picture over here, this is a section drawing of 49th Street, which is surrounded by all these little numbered lots. All right, you can go to the next one. All right, the profile drawing is this drawing over here, the bottom one. The top one is a site. So it shows the relationship between the elevations and the stations of interest. On the y-axis, that's the elevations which will be collected by the surveyors. And on the x-axis, it shows the stations of interest, which, for example, for every 50 feet, 2 plus 50 is noted as a common station that represents 250 feet. So this is used in so many different areas in construction. For example, it's also highly used in transportation plans for highway designs. You can go to the next one. Elevation drawings. So an elevation drawing is probably the most common way to show how a building looks. So when you're going outside into your front lawn and looking back into your house, that's an elevation view of looking at your house. It shows the vertical drawing of a particular structure, whether it's exterior or interior. Exterior shows how a house is going to look. So that's on the left over here. And on the right, it shows the interior view of the house, which shows basically everything that's going on through the walls. So this is extremely useful for contractors and owners because it gives sort of that communication on where everything is going to go in the house, where the boiler is going to go, and where the heating is going to go. And it just makes life like a lot easier. You can go to the next one. The floor plan is basically a bird's eye view of looking at one particular floor. So it displays clear measurements of every room, walling, and flooring in that particular floor. And it has an accurate representation on how you're going to move through that space. Okay. These are the sources.
All right, that was our presentation on site plans. Thank you for listening.
Yeah.
Bro, I'm not going to lie. Them texts were kind of distracting.